Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you for yet another episode of Universe Rights. And we have a very, very special, and indeed, we are very grateful to have him with us today, Dave Gaulson. I've heard him once in Bhutan when he was speaking at the Mountain Echoes Festival, but and it was a veritable treat, and it also very eye-opening and insightful. So here am I introducing you all to Dave Gaulson, who is a professor of biology at the University of Sussex, and he specializes in bee ecology. um, I think he has a more than admirable number of oops, I'm sorry, uh, admirable number of scientific articles, but he is also an author of Bumblebees, Their Behavior, Ecology, and Conservation, and another like raving bestseller, Sting in the Tail, which is again a book about bumblebees, followed by A Buzz in the Meadow, then Bequest and the Garden Jungle, and he's also founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006, which has over 12,000 members now. um, he's got a lot of awards, and I'm not going to take up more time on that, but you can imagine that you have a stalwart amongst us today. Very warm welcome to you, Dave, and thank you so much for making time for being with us and speaking to our audience for this episode of Universe Rights that's presented by Sri Siemens in association with Prabhakatan Foundation. Handing it over to you, Dave, and looking forward to listening to you.
Thanks very much for introducing me and for inviting me to talk to you today about insects and about my new book called Silent Earth, which is all about insects and why they're important and their declines and what we can do to look after them. I've been really lucky. I've been interested in insects all my life. From only I don't know 5 or 6 years old, I became fascinated by them. I have no idea why, and I've been lucky to make a career out of chasing around after insects. I'm paid to do this, which is a real privilege. So where do I start telling you about insects? They're such an amazing and diverse group. It's difficult to know. So I thought I'd start at the beginning. So insects are a really ancient group of creatures. They evolved over 300 million years ago, before the dinosaurs. Now, my favorite insects are bees. I specialize in studying wild bees of different types. And they came a little bit later, about 100 million years ago. So that was in the middle of the age of the dinosaurs. And bees evolved from wasps. Bees are essentially vegetarian wasps. Wasps tend to be carnivores. The ancestor of bees would have been a wasp that fed its offspring on paralyzed insects or possibly spiders, and for some reason it switched to feeding them on pollen and nectar instead. And that was the first bee, and it's proved to be a very successful way of life. And bees have proliferated. Lots of different species have evolved over the millennia. To this day, they're the only insects that eat pollen and nectar from flowers throughout their lives. So there are lots of insects which, as adults, things like butterflies, visit flowers for the nectar. But there are very few insects, apart from bees, that feed on pollen and nectar from when they hatch from their egg right through to when they die. And they manage to do that because the adult bees have a nest and they collect the food, the pollen and the nectar, and they put it in the nest. So they feed it to their offspring, so the offspring don't have to gather it for themselves. And bees have evolved all sorts of clever ways to collect pollen and nectar from flowers efficiently. They're very intelligent insects. They can remember where patches of flowers are, and they can navigate through the landscape without getting lost, so that they can find their way back to to their nests. They have fur, which helps them to, it acts like a brush when they're on the flowers and brushes off the pollen. And you can see this little bee has done so very effectively. In fact, it's got so much pollen on it, it can hardly fly. Now the bee collects the pollen to feed to its babies, but some of it gets spilled, and as the bee moves from flower to flower, that spillage ensures that the flowers get pollinated, so the bees benefit and the flowers benefit. Now, I've already mentioned there are lots of different types of bee. And this is an important point because I think many people don't realize this. Certainly in Europe, there are many members of the public who think there's just one type of bee and it pollinates everything. Well, that's actually long, long way from the truth. I guess they're thinking of the honeybee. This is a honeybee, the common domestic bee that is kept around the world. But it's actually just one of about 25,000 different species of bee. So there are also the bumblebees, which are actually my favorites, not common in most of India, but you do have them in the mountains in the north. Beautiful furry bees. There are solitary bees that don't live in a hive, they live on their own. Things like this rather handsome, we call it the hairy-footed flower bee, because the male has big hairy feet that he uses to stroke the face of the female when they're mating, and she seems to like his hairy feet. There are leafcutter bees that make nests by sewing together little bits of leaf. There are mining bees that make their nests in the ground by burrowing into soil. Longhorn longhorn bees, which are named because they have these enormous antennae that the males use to sniff out the females. Woolcarder bees, cuckoo bees. Now, cuckoo bees look rather like wasps. And just like the bird, they sneak into the nests of other bees and lay their eggs. They don't look after the offspring themselves. They trick other bees into looking after them for them. There are mason bees that build their nests out of mud. And look at that. That is a glorious type of carpenter bee, the blue carpenter bee that's from China. I've never seen that species. I hope one day I get the chance. It's a magnificent beastie. And then another of my favorites is orchid bees. These are just a few of the 25,000 species of bee in the world. The orchid bees live in Central and South America. They're like little flying jewels. They're all metallic green and blue, and some of them are orange or red. Amazing, gorgeous little creatures. So bees are wonderfully diverse and have been very successful for a long time. They survived the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs. But sadly now they're in trouble, and this is something that's haunted me through my career as a scientist studying bees, is that it's become very clear that they're disappearing. I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. So this is one close to my home, a British bumblebee, a lovely little thing that we call the shrill carder bumblebee. And it used to be found, as you can see from this map on the left here, all over Britain. So that's its historic kind of range, pre-1960. But as time has gone on, it's been disappearing. And now this bee, on this map, is now confined to about 6 little populations spread around the southern part of the United Kingdom. But actually, even since I became interested in these bees and started looking for them, I saw them first place I saw this bee was on Salisbury Plain, which is where that little green ring has just appeared. That population has now gone extinct. So it's gone from 6 populations down to 5 populations. And that one is just about to disappear. There are just 1 or 2 bees left there now. So this bee is going extinct before our eyes, and there seems to be nothing we can do to stop it. It's terrifying. There are plenty of other examples. So for example, this bumblebee has gone globally extinct. That's it. This is called Franklin's bumblebee. It was a species that used to live, this map, the red dots show you where it used to be found. This is the west coast of the United States, California and Oregon. Anyway, it hasn't been seen since 2006. Franklin's bumblebee is no more. And that's rather sad to think that no one will ever see a Franklin's bumblebee on the wing again. But it isn't just bees that are disappearing, it's insects that seem to be disappearing. And this really came to the forefront of public knowledge in about 2017, when a study was published from Germany that got media coverage around the world. It's based on data collected by German insect enthusiasts using this funny thing called a malaise trap, which looks a bit like a kind of tent. And it catches all types of flying insect. And what this messy looking chart shows you is the weight of insects caught per day, per trap, and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. And you can see it declined a lot. That in that 26-year period, the weight of insects, of flying insects in Germany, fell by 76%. So 3/4 of the insects seem to have disappeared. Now, that sparked a debate about whether there was something strange happening in Germany or whether this was more widespread. And most people agree that it's almost certainly a global phenomenon, although there are lots of countries for which we have very little data, and India is one of those, sadly. There's one aspect of this that, in large part, people haven't really, most ordinary people don't notice the disappearance of a bumblebee or a butterfly. That happens gradually over time. But one thing that certainly people in Europe have noticed over recent decades is that this no longer happens. When I was a kid, if you went for a long drive in the summer, you would have to stop every hour or two to clean the windscreen because it was just covered in splattered insects, so much so that you literally couldn't see where you were going anymore. That just doesn't happen anymore. Exactly when it ended is hard to say, but it does seem that there's been a huge decline in the abundance of insects, certainly in Europe and North America, and probably elsewhere too. And there's an interesting aspect of this, and this might seem a strange sort of change in direction. But I want to talk about shifting baselines, because this is the idea that we all grow up thinking that the world that we experience when we're young is how the world is supposed to be, is how it's always been. We think that that is normal. But of course, each generation has a different idea of what normal is. And that's illustrated really nicely by this interesting study of the game fish catches from people paying money to go out and catch fish for fun from Florida in the United States. And this study was done using photographs, because people, when they come back with their catch of fish, they like to be photographed with their haul to show how many fish they've caught or how big the fish were they caught. The interesting thing is that the old photographs from the 1950s showed great big fish, sharks and enormous tuna and all sorts of things. But you see that over time, they got smaller and smaller. And now when the ships come back or the boats come back, the biggest fish they've caught are tiddlers. So obviously the big fish have disappeared from the ocean. So this is telling us, something about our impacts on the planet. But what's really interesting, which the authors of this study point out, is that the smiles on the faces of the fishermen haven't got any smaller. This lady, bottom right, is just as happy with her relatively small fish as these guys were decades earlier, catching a big fish, because she doesn't know what she's missing. She doesn't realize that had she been fishing 30, 40 years ago, she would have been catching much bigger fish. If she knew that, she might be quite sad with her catch. And you might wonder why on earth I'm talking about fish. I slightly wonder it myself. But it's because there's a more general point here, which is that there's a real danger that the next generation of children will grow up in a world where they don't know the sound of buzzing bees and chirping grasshoppers and crickets, where they don't see the beautiful colors of butterflies' wings or hear birdsong. And they think that's normal. They have no idea what they're missing. And that would be really sad to me. I have children myself, and I'm terrified that they will grow up in a world that's missing most of its wonderful biodiversity. So anyway, back to insects. Insects, as I alluded right at the beginning, are really important. And this was put very nicely by an American biologist called Ed Wilson. I won't read his whole quote out, but he basically said that if people disappeared, the planet would do just fine without us. But that if insects were to vanish, as he put it, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I want to explain to you why he said that and why I think he's correct. Well, so firstly, insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. We've so far named about 1.5 million species of animal and plant on our planet, of which 1.1 million are different types of insects. So they are biodiversity, or at least more than 2/3 of it. But then they're food for an enormous number of other creatures like birds and bats and freshwater fish and lizards and amphibians and so on. So just imagine if you're one of these gorgeous bee eaters living in Germany, 3/4 of your food has disappeared in the last 26 years, and that's obviously going to have big impacts. But then insects do a whole host of other things too. They're vitally important in pest control. They're biocontrol agents. They're recyclers of dung and dead bodies and dead trees and leaves and all sorts of other organic material. They keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. You name it, they're involved in doing it, which is why Ed Wilson said that without them, the environment would collapse into chaos. Of course, the thing that insects do for us that most people do recognize is this: they pollinate. 87% of all the plant species in the world need pollinating by some kind of animal. And in tropical regions, it's sometimes a bird, but in most of the world, most of the time, it's an insect. Not always a bee. As you can see here, there are many types of insect that pollinate, including butterflies and moths, lots of different species of fly and beetles and wasps and so on. And between them, they pollinate the large majority of all the plants in the world. And without that pollination, all of these plants would disappear. All the beautiful wildflowers in the world would disappear. And of course, from a selfish human perspective, most of our food would disappear. So we've become used to the shops having lots of different fruits and vegetables available all year round. And if we didn't have insect pollinators, things wouldn't look anywhere near so good. We wouldn't have a great many of the fruits and vegetables we take for granted. We wouldn't have apples or cherries or strawberries or raspberries or blueberries or tomatoes or aubergines, chili peppers, even coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So life would be pretty dire without these little creatures. What we need to avoid is ending up like this. These pictures look quite nice, but these people are in southwest China in an area of extensive apple and pear orchards, and they now have to hand pollinate the flowers because there aren't any insects left. So the people do it manually, and they send their children climbing high up into the branches. It's a terrifying prospect, and it wouldn't be practical for farmers everywhere in the world to do this. Now, one solution that's been suggested to this kind of the disappearance of bees and other pollinators is that we should replace them with robots. And there are actually labs around the world doing this right now, building robot bees to replace our disappearing real bees. It's an interesting idea, I guess, if you're a robotics engineer. Is this viable? But in practice, I would think that it's ridiculous to think that we can replace bees, not least because there's so many of them. So just the honeybee, the domestic bee, there are about 3 trillion of them in the world. So to replace them, are we really going to build 3 trillion little robots? And think of all the resources, the plastic, the metal that would require, and they're going to need maintenance, and they're going to break down. They're going to get caught out in the rain and end up littering the countryside. Or imagine, Chinese or Russian computer hackers break into the Bee-Bot control system and turn them against us. It seems crazy to go down this route when we have real bees that have been pollinating flowers for 100 million years. They're really good at it, and they're carbon neutral, they're self-replicating, they're biodegradable. They seem to have all the properties you would want from a pollinator. And it seems to me it would be much cheaper and more sensible to look after bees than to build their replacements. So to do that, we need to understand why they've declined. Why are insects disappearing? Well, actually, it's complicated. There are lots of reasons, and I haven't got time to go into them at all. I'm only going to say a little bit about the first two on this list, loss of habitat and pesticides, but there are others: diseases, climate change, effects of light pollution, and so on. But we'll have to leave those for another day. So one of the biggest drivers of insect decline and of wildlife decline around the world has been loss of flower-rich habitats. Bees need flowers, and if there aren't flowers, there'll be no bees. It's as simple as that. And the world used to have lots of flower-rich habitats, like this beautiful flowering meadow from Scotland in the United Kingdom. But most of those meadows have gone. Most of our natural forests, or many of them, have gone, replaced by things like this, by intensive agriculture, by monocultures of crops, which support very little in the way of biodiversity. And in some countries, this kind of intensive farming has spread over huge areas. So for example, now in parts of North America, they have fields that are tens of thousands of hectares in size. And whatever biodiversity once lived there, it's been entirely scrubbed away and replaced by our crops. And of course, this is also happening to our tropical forests with their replacement with palm oil trees and other crops. It's happening everywhere around the world. So that's habitat loss. Associated with that is the very heavy use of pesticides, which is something that really didn't begin until the 1940s, 1950s, and in the last 70 years has become the norm in farming all around the world. And the number of pesticides used every year increases every year, so that at the moment it's estimated that about 2 million tons of pesticides are applied to the world each year. Now, these are poisons. These are designed to kill either insects or plants or fungi or slugs and snails. Crops in the UK are treated on average with 17 different pesticides each year. So we shouldn't really be surprised if insects are declining. In some parts of the world, pesticides are sprayed from the air so that they drift across the countryside, not just affecting the insects in the crop field, but drifting into forests and hedgerows and any other habitat nearby, killing everything that they come into contact with. In poorer countries, I took this picture in just outside Calcutta. Poorer farmers are often using pesticides without any protective equipment at all. This man is spraying a herbicide called paraquat, which is incredibly poisonous to people. And he's doing it barefoot with bare hands using an old leaky sprayer so that his hands, I could see, were wet with this poison. It's absolutely nuts. We spray these things in our gardens. This is a picture from North America where it's common to fog insecticides in gardens to kill pests, but it kills everything. It seems to me completely nuts that we're waging war on nature. And just to illustrate the global extent of this kind of harm, I'm sorry, this is a terribly complicated diagram, map of the world, but I just direct you to the little round circles of different kind of shades of orange. So this is taken from a study of honey. It was conducted by a Swiss lab, and they asked people going on holiday around the world to bring them back a honey sample, honey being, of course, collected by honeybees. And they then screened it. They were interested in a particular type of insecticide called neonicotinoid insecticides, which are notorious for being incredibly poisonous to bees. It takes just a tiny amount, 4 billionths of a gram of one of these pesticides to kill a honeybee. And the color of the little dot shows you the amount of these pesticides found in the honey. So the white ones had no pesticide in them, but 3/4 of these honey samples from around the world, from all sorts of places, from Canada to India to Australia, 3/4 of them contained these neurotoxins, which are incredibly poisonous to honeybees. So 3/4 of the honeybees in the world are being poisoned right now. And if honeybees are being poisoned, all the insects, all the pollinators that visit flowers are being poisoned. Little wonder, really, that insects are in trouble. So that's all terribly depressing, isn't it? But what can we do about this? Well, the good news is that we can all get involved. It's not too late. Most insects haven't gone extinct, like Franklin's bumblebee, and they can recover quite quickly if we look after them. And there's really two areas I'm going to focus on, where the first of which is one that everyone can get involved in, which is trying to look after insects in urban areas. So some of this may seem less relevant to you folk in India than it is in Europe. So forgive me if that's true. And I don't know exactly which plants are best to grow in urban areas in India, because it's not a country that I'm sufficiently familiar with. But I do think there's huge potential to turn our gardens and our city parks and other urban green spaces into a network of tiny little nature reserves. It's what I try to do in my own garden, which is just behind the screen here. And in fact, this is a picture from my own garden. In the UK, there are 22 million private gardens, and then a whole load of other council-owned, publicly owned green spaces, parks, cemeteries, road verges, roundabouts, and so on. Just imagine if they were all full of flowers and pesticide-free and managed in a way that encouraged wildlife. That would be a great network of habitat. So I think there's real potential here. And this is one of my books, one of my recent books, The Garden Jungle, is all about rewilding a garden, making it more attractive to insects and birds and other wildlife. So just some very quick and simple pointers as to what you might do. There are many ornamental plants available to gardeners wherever you live in the world. In the UK, it's estimated there are about 70,000 different varieties and cultivars of ornamental plants that are available. So which ones should you grow if you want to keep bees and butterflies happy? Well, one rule of thumb is avoid what are called double varieties. These along the top are double varieties. They're mutants in which the male parts of the flower that normally produce the pollen have mutated into extra petals. So if you look bottom left, the perils of giving a talk from home. There's someone hammering next door. This rose bottom left is very attractive to insects. It's a kind of wild type rose, and it's lovely. And these bits, these dark orange bits around the center, we call them the anthers. They're the male parts of the flower that produce the pollen. In this rose, the standard sort of garden rose that people commonly grow, that's a mutant in which those anthers have turned into petals. So there is no pollen. It's completely useless from a bee's perspective. So we might think it's pretty, but a bee would think it's an abomination. So avoid those kinds of flowers and stick to the simple single varieties. And if you can find out what's best for gardens in your region, it's extraordinary how many insects will come to live in a garden. So the UK has very low biodiversity compared to India, but nonetheless, there was a really interesting study done in Leicester, which is a town in northern England, where a lady called Jenny Owens, she had a little garden in the centre of Leicester, 0.07 of a hectare, so a really small garden. She spent 35 years trying to identify every single animal and plant that she could find in her little garden. And after 35 years, her total species count was 2,673 species, of which 1,997 were different types of insect. So it's like a rainforest. You can have extraordinary biodiversity living just in your garden. If you plant the right flowers, if you plant some flowering trees, particularly fruit trees are fantastic to encourage pollinators. If you have a lawn, if you include flowers in that too. This is my lawn, and if we can get past the sort of aiming for the neat mown lawn with stripes up and down, many people seem keen on trying to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis court. But if instead you let the grass grow longer, usually flowers will appear as they have here. And just imagine if every park had flowering lawns instead of boring mown green lawns, then that alone would make a really big difference. So we can turn our gardens into areas that are really attractive and support a great diversity of life. But our gardens cover a relatively small area compared to farmland globally and nationally. What about farming? We've, as I've already explained, we've gone down an avenue of intensive farming, which has done terrible damage to biodiversity. It's one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity globally, but it's also not sustainable, I think, for other reasons. So farming globally contributes about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions and is also responsible for the degradation and erosion of soils around the world. And just as we need bees, we need soil if we're going to grow crops in the future. So I don't think this intensive industrialized farming system is really sustainable long term. I think there are better ways to feed the world, not least because currently we waste about 1/3 of the food that we grow. So actually, currently the world grows about 3 times as many calories as we need to feed the global human population. But then we throw 1/3 of it away, and we feed another 1/3 of it roughly to animals, which we then feed to people, which is simply a really inefficient way of feeding people. Now, I'm not here to preach that we should all become vegetarian or vegan, because I do still eat meat, but we shouldn't eat much meat because it's not an efficient way of feeding people. And there's a really interesting fact I read the other day. 60% of all the farmland in the world is used to produce beef, which provides us with just 3% of the food we eat. That is just crazy, isn't it? So if we could all eat less meat and stop wasting food, we could set aside huge areas of land for biodiversity, for wildlife, to ensure that our future generations don't live in a world without all these wonderful creatures. We also simply eat too much, and this is a growing problem globally. It used to be associated with the United States and Western Europe, but it's happening everywhere. Sorry about this awful picture, isn't that a terrible sight? But we do simply eat more than is good for us, and we make ourselves ill by eating lots of food, all food produced in a way that's really damaging to the environment. It's absurd and obscene when you stop to think about it. In the UK, 27% of us are now clinically obese, which is giving rise to a huge epidemic of diabetes around the world, which costs our health services enormous amounts of money. It reduces our life expectancy. It's just really bad for us because we eat too much, and we eat too much of the wrong type of food. We don't eat enough fruit and veg because we don't grow enough fruit and veg. So what should a truly sustainable farming system look like? How can we really support wildlife, support bees and beetles and butterflies and birds, and produce food at the same time? Or is it that we have to have one or the other? Well, I would argue that they have to go together, that we actually need to come up with a system of farming that looks after the soil, that captures carbon in the soil, so it's helping to combat climate change and ensures that the soil remains healthy and suitable for growing crops into the future. Oh, my lovely wife is just delivering a cup of tea. Thank you very much. And we need a system of farming that, rather than trying to control and kill everything, works with nature, that it works with bees. It encourages bees so that the crops are pollinated. It encourages natural enemies of crop pests so that the farmer isn't reliant on pesticides. And to do that, of course, it means massively reducing or ideally eliminating pesticide use, because you can't have healthy populations of bees and natural enemies of crop pests if you're spraying insecticides all the time. And of course, whatever system of farming we come up with, it needs to produce enough food for humans and enough healthy food so that we can have good, healthy diets. And that might seem like a big ask, but actually there are really interesting types of farming being developed around the world that do deliver all of these things. Things like agroforestry. This is a picture from India. Agroforestry combines growing woody perennial plants with annual short-lived plants like lettuces that you grow in rows under each other. You have a huge crop diversity. The trees keep the soil held together. Because it's much more diverse, you have many more bees and other pollinators, and you have many more natural enemies of crop pests, so that you don't need to use pesticides. And the evidence is that systems like this are much more sustainable, support much more biodiversity, and produce a lot of food at the same time. As does permaculture, which is a system of farming that was developed in Australia, which is rather similar to agroforestry in a way. And also biodynamic farming, which I don't know if has ever spread to India, but is popular in Western Europe. They're all systems of farming that are really focused on soil health and on environmental health, and in essence, on working with nature rather than against it. So I think if we're really going to look after our planet, then we need to basically do much less farming like that on the left and much more farming like that on the right. So, to sum up, this is our gorgeous planet. It's an amazing place. We take it for granted. We don't usually stop to think about how extraordinary it is. We're clinging to the surface of a rock hurtling through space. Us and 1.5 million other species of animal and plant that we've named so far. It's actually estimated there may be as many as 5 million sharing our planet. Most species have yet even to be described, and we discover new ones every day. It's completely unique. It gives us everything. It gives us water and food and clean air and our home and a source of inspiration and beauty. And it's astonishing that we don't look after it better. Why don't we regard this as our most precious possession? There is no planet B, as they say. And there's a real danger that if we carry on with this reckless disregard for our planet, that the next generation, that our children and our children's children will grow up in a world that's lost most of its natural resources and been stripped of most of its natural beauty. And we have to do better than that. And I think we can do better. And what better place to start than by looking after these vitally important little creatures that live all around us. Thank you, everybody, very much for listening. I'd be very happy to take any questions you have about the wonderful world of insects. But first, I want a cup of tea.
We have one question from Swati Motwani. She is asking that what are the better ways to feed the world? If we don't use pesticides and insecticides, then half of the population of the world will be hungry.
I don't believe that to be true. There have been a lot of studies of this, and organic farming, pesticide-free farming, produces yields on average that are between 80 and 90% of the yields of intensive farming. Most of that difference is due to fertilizers, not due to pesticides. So it's not that much less. And when you consider the facts that I mentioned in the talk, that we waste a third of the food that we grow, and that we eat way too much meat, which is a really inefficient way of feeding people, then actually we could easily feed everybody in the world with entirely pesticide-free farming if we could just tackle the food waste issue and the overconsumption of meat. It's as simple as that, in my opinion.
We have another question from Sukant, and Sukant, please ask your question.
Vishaka, you have to unmute him.
Yeah, I've done that.
Still mute.
It's coming as talking permitted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. What are your views on tilling the land?
What are my views on
Tilling.
tilling?
Yes.
Yeah, so there seems to be a lot of evidence that it's much better for the soil and soil health and for the amount of carbon sequestered in the soil to not till wherever possible. It raises problems, or some problems, with how best to control weeds, because farmers traditionally have often controlled weeds by ploughing. But there are alternatives, and I think the general consensus is that wherever possible, we should avoid ploughing, particularly deep ploughing into the soil.
Thank you.
We have another question from Dr. Shivdat.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello? Yes.
Hello, hi, you can hear me. Hi, Dave. Insightful talk on insects, pesticides, and the ecology. Just a question, slightly digressing from your topic, but what about your thoughts on genetically modified male mosquitoes, which are making headlines in the US, regarding the control of the mosquito population in the US, So what is your take on ecology and the other aspects regarding insects and the whole, biodiversity? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I can see there are some types of insect that do cause humans huge problems through spreading disease. And I can see why people might want to eradicate them where possible. But we should bear in mind that there will be repercussions, that mosquitoes, for example, are food for a lot of organisms, lots of birds and bats and so on. So if we could come up with techniques that would eradicate them, that would have knock-on effects through ecosystems. And we do need to be careful before I would be very nervous of introducing any technology which would actually completely wipe out whole species, which is something that's potentially going to become possible in the near future.
Thank you very much.
We have another question from Shubha Menon. She's asking that, could you please tell us again which varieties of flowers are best grown in our balconies in North India?
Well, so I don't know Northern India well, I'm afraid. I'm not the person to ask. In Northern India, I mean, obviously it's depending on where you are, in some places it's cooler, and maybe not so different to Europe in some respects. I mean, certainly lots of herb plants are very good for pollinators, things like oregano, rosemary, thyme, which I imagine would probably, and they certainly grow in pots very well in Europe. Whether they're suited to Northern India, I suspect there may be other people on listening that have a better idea actually than I. I've only been to Northern India a couple of times in my life, so perhaps someone else could type in some advice if they know.
So we have another question from Sunita Panbansal. She's asking, what is your opinion about growing plants that are resistant to insects?
Resistant plant varieties can be really important. And in fact, plant breeders for many, many decades now have been trying to grow plant varieties, selecting for varieties that were more resistant to insect pests. And that ought to be part of our strategy to minimize or eliminate pesticide use. But that's different from genetically modifying crops to make them more resistant to pests. I'm a little bit nervous of genetic modification, mainly because it mostly seems to be done from the motive of profit by big corporations like Monsanto. and usually involves use of more pesticides rather than less. So if you look at what's happened in North America since they started using genetically modified crops, the pesticide use, particularly of herbicides, has greatly increased. So instead of using genetic modification as a tool to make crops that can be grown in a more environmentally friendly way, they're actually growing them in a less environmentally friendly way. The classic herbicide resistant genetically modified crops, they're glyphosate resistant or dicamba resistant. And that means the farmer can apply fertilizers as much as he likes, herbicides as much as he likes, without any fear of killing his crop because it's been engineered to be resistant. So that kind of use seems disastrous to me. But I do think that genetically modified crops, if they were being developed by a beneficial, benign organization with the well-being of mankind and the environment in mind, could have great potential. Meeta, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, just 1 second. I had a brief question. Give me a second.
You can hear some lovely sounds in the background.
Yeah, it's evening time, right? There are lots of birds chirping in my garden. You've also done a lot of work under the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And you've also been named the social innovator for the year in 2010 for biotechnology and biological sciences. What does that kind of work entail? Why were you named the social innovator? What did you do? Because it'll be really fascinating for us to learn, because that's another side of you.
Yeah, so for a long time, I was a traditional scientist, publishing scientific papers in journals that hardly anybody reads apart from other scientists. And I was working on insect declines and what we could do about it, but my work wasn't being read by anybody that was going to make the world a better place or use any of that information. And it was really frustrating. You can publish as many scientific papers as you like, and it's not going to save one single bee unless someone takes the information and uses it to make the world a better place. And because no one else was doing it, in desperation, really, I thought I'd try and set up this charity with the express purpose of creating habitat for bumblebees, of campaigning, of raising awareness, of getting the public involved in making their gardens more bumblebee friendly and so on. And I didn't know what I was doing. I had no training, or I've never run any kind of company or charity in my life. So we started it, as you mentioned, in 2006. And for the first few years, it was absolutely shambolic. We had no idea what we were doing. We nearly went bankrupt, I don't know how many times. It was very unprofessional, but somehow we muddled through and it slowly grew. And now I have nothing to do with running it. I sort of retired from that, but it's really successful. And, it has 42 staff, 12,000 members. You can walk through meadows full of flowers that wouldn't have existed had the Bumblebee Conservation Trust not been invented. So it's really, really gratifying. It's one of the best things I've ever done. It's also why I write books, is to try and actually, try and make a difference, try and inspire people to change their ways, change their habits, to reduce their impact on the planet and so on. And I think scientists should do this more, to be honest. A lot of scientists are a bit shy or unwilling to step outside sort of traditional academia, but I found that it's really rewarding if you do.
It indeed is. It sounds wonderful if you're talking about so many large fields and meadows that has been great. Thank you so much for, I'm sure, I hope somebody out here in the audience gets inspired by you to do something similar in India, because God knows we need it. There is one question from Suniti. Vishakha, will you unmute her, please?
Yes. Done.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Yeah. I live in a complex which has 12-story apartment buildings. And we have a huge problem with honeybees building their hives here, particularly this last month. And the only way they seem to get rid of them is by killing them in their thousands. So I was wondering, is there a better way of making sure that they don't build their hives in the apartment buildings?
It's difficult without seeing the buildings to work out whether there's anything you could do. Are they nesting in cavities that could perhaps be sealed up so that they can't get in?
No, these are kind of shades outside the window, concrete ledges.
Okay.
They're suspending them from that.
So the root of the problem is probably that the beekeepers in the area are allowing their bees to swarm, which means the colonies are splitting and sending out.
If I can interrupt, I don't think these are sort of cultivated bees. These are just wild bees from the neighborhood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's something we don't have a problem with in Europe generally. There are very few honeybees in the wild. It's very difficult. I'm afraid I don't think I have a simple solution for you. Try contacting your local beekeepers if you can and see if they can come up with a solution, because they would normally be delighted to take the bees off your hand if they're accessible, but it can be difficult to remove established colonies. But talk to them, hopefully they can help.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very, very insightful and generous, I would say, sharing of your presentation, because it's definitely aroused a lot of interest among all of us. And I have a very sweet comment that's coming from one of our audience members. Her name is Timmy, and she works a lot. She works a lot in terms of for fostering animals and helping stray animals and all of that. She's one of our activists in Jaipur. And she's written a very beautiful note for you saying, "Dear Dave, thank you for a beautiful talk. I do not use pesticide in my garden, and I have about 11 large beehives, trying to grow many varieties of trees to attract butterflies and bees. I will not now onwards mow my lawn, and I will let wildflowers grow. Nothing stirs me more than trees, birds, and animals. Thank you for the wonderful work that you do for the planet."
Thank you. That's lovely, isn't it? Thank you, Timmy.
Yes,
up the
I think
great work.
that's a brilliant way to end such a beautiful beautiful session. Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you everyone there who's attended the talk for joining us for this evening. We'll be in touch with you, Dave. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.